In my 9 years of marriage, I have discovered through counseling and through countless conversations with other married couples, 4 main issues that corrode marriages. 4 enemies that every married couple will have to fight against for the rest of their lives. Knowing each enemy by name is one of the keys as to why some marriages do better than others. It is not mainly because this couple is fighting harder. It is basically because this couple is far more effective than this one. One is punching the air more than the other one. And don't worry, I also hate self-proclaimed marriage YouTube experts. I am most definitely not one of those. I have something better to offer you: friendship. A friendly conversation on things we're all struggling with. And just because we're now friends, I'm gonna offer you a bonus at the end. A bonus that glues all these 4 things together. So stay till the end for that. Resentment. Resentment in a marriage is inevitable, which means that every marriage needs a release valve from the pressure that comes from the inevitable accumulation of resentment. That bitter feeling of indignation for not being treated fairly inevitably builds up for mainly one reason, is that marriages are not and cannot be an even 50-50 split. Depending on the season, one spouse is given more and sacrificing more than the other spouse. And we'll never know exactly who it is, because if you ask each spouse, according to them, they are the ones who are given more and sacrificing more than the other one. Only God knows who's actually right. But the fact is that both are keeping record of it all. And that bill will be charged one day, and it won't be a very nice day for you guys. It is never an even game, especially because in our minds, we are a lot more biased towards our own effort and pain. So cement this in your mind. Resentment, as we speak, is building up in your spouse's heart and mind. Now, if you are smarter, more empathetic, and more attuned to your spouse, this resentment is building at a much slower pace, but building nonetheless. Now that we can acknowledge this reality, what can we do about it? Well, this is where the pressure valve or valves come into play. Let me offer 2, and you might have other ones, so please, if you do, put them in the comments. 2 questions that any couple can incorporate in their relationship. Pressure valve number 1, ask your partner, is there anything that I said or did last week that made you feel devalued or unseen? Pressure valve number 2, how do you feel about last week's or last month's family schedule and activities? Is there anything you would like to change? Now, from your spouse's response to those 2 questions, you should adjust your weeks and months accordingly. Finances, expectation, philosophy, and lifestyle. The world has changed, and us millennials and even Gen Zers are going through a particular moment in history that is messing not only with our mental health, but our marriages too. And we need to talk about this. We all have unspoken financial expectations that we assume we would meet in our adulthood. For most of us, nothing crazy, just like financial stability, a good job, a house, a car, retirement, things we saw many of our boomer parents achieve. But in our current situation, the more we age, the more we realize that many or most of those expectations will not be met. And this is, for the most part, unconsciously bringing grief, stress, and anxiety to many millennial marriages. And many of us have not been able to put this struggle, this weight into words with our spouses. Many of us just feel this pressure, like something is choking you, or like we're constantly underwater. And it's affecting our mood, our mental health. We've become very sensitive, very reactionary, very reactive, like we're on the edge all the time. And your spouse knows this. Yet many of us are still in denial. Many of us have to come to terms with the fact that many of us did what we were told to do, study, get that job, and you would get XYZ. But we did it and we're not reaping the rewards or the results. And I know I might be sounding right now very materialistic. I'm aware of that. But many of these dreams and desires we had go back all the way to our childhood. Hence why many of these dreams are a lot more tender than we're willing to admit, especially as Christians. Because as Christians, many of us feel guilty for feeling this, because for many of us, going to the Bible or to God to satiate this materialistic desires feels wrong. So we're fighting this alone. And we need to start putting these feelings in the unconscious into words and share them with our spouses. Because just as the famous quote of Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Being the enemy of each other's growth and evolution. One thing that we're seldom taught is that our ideas of who we are, what we believe, and what we desire are fluid and contextual. They're not set in stone. It changes with age. It changes when we move to a different city. It changes when we go to another church. It changes when we switch jobs. It changes. We've all had friends who one day decided to move to a different country, and 2 years later, they come back to visit and they're unrecognizable. They are no longer who they used to be, and you hate them for it. It grieves you. You basically have this resentment against them because they killed the person you loved. But the sad reality is that many of us, are doing the same thing to our spouses. Our spouses are changing, and we're starting to resent them for it. Many of us have started doing big and small things in order to delay that process, or even, if possible, stop it. For example, for some, their spouse has become a vegetarian. For some, our spouse that wanted to have 4 kids no longer wants to have kids. Some of our spouses want to switch careers. Some, they want to leave the country, or others have decided that they don't want to go to church because they don't believe in the Bible anymore. But the worst thing that we can do in these cases is to be the enemy of our spouse's exploration, of our spouse's evolution, and to purposefully become a roadblock in the journey. Being that enemy will not only create a tear in your relationship, but would also breed resentment. Being the enemy here does not work. Shaming or belittling their exploration or desires in order to get them back to who they were before is not going to work. 2 things are true here. Change is inevitable, but there are things you can do so you can both survive this change. This is what I suggest you should do. Keep an open line of communication all the way through, from start to end. But not just any line of communication. Those lines of communications cannot be full of manipulation or shame. What you need is for that line of communication to be filled with 2 things: trust and compassionate curiosity. If your favorite person, your spouse, is still a loving spouse and a lovely parent, do your best to trust their process and let him or her know that you're there. And for the spouses that are doing all this exploration, trust that your significant other that's right now angry and scared at your process loves you and wants the best for you, and that they're not having an easy time with it either. Remember that exploration process can be hard, threatening, and lonely for both members of this marriage in different and frequently opposite ways. Include each other in your explorations, because at the end of the day, this whole thing might just be that, an exploration. But know what some of you might be thinking? There are indeed non-negotiables for you, and that is okay and healthy. Those have to be part of the conversation as both of you explore these things together. Some of your non-negotiables might be that you're not willing to give up on your dream of having kids, or you're not willing to have a spouse that you only see 3 times a year. Those non-negotiables have to be part of those conversations as well. My generation lives in this internal perpetual cognitive dissonance. The direct or indirect training that we received as kids in terms of the role of the male and the female in the marriage is being opposed and sometimes even bullied by what we actually believe on that matter today. We're constantly fighting our own internal programming. Both spouses are. And if that wasn't enough, we're constantly navigating the uncharted territory of a marriage without defined gender roles. And it scares me that my kid is gonna inherit that confusion as my wife and I fumble through building a marriage with more equality, distribution of power, and non-violence. For example, my wife's believing family is a very traditional believing family like mine. And it was somewhat easy to reject the most outright destructive behaviors that we inherited from our families, like all the cheating and beatings and teenage pregnancies. But as you know, it is the subtle things that are the real problems in the long run. Like in my case, violence. There was a lot of violence in my family towards me as a kid. And every day I have to fight the good fight against my internal violent programming and treat my kid, my 5-year-old kid, gently. Your case might not be an issue with violence. It might have been with infidelity in your family. That was also mine. In your case, might also be substance abuse. And the question is, how do we fight that internal programming? Well, that brings me into the bonus that glues all of these points together. Therapy. Depending on who you are and your background, the word therapy will be like, come on, again, therapy, or be like, yeah, I get it, therapy. Because the fact is, most people that don't go to therapy tend to be the Christians. Because the reality is, we need help with all those 4 things that I mentioned. You know, resentment, our internal unconscious expectation, having compassionate curiosity with ourselves and our spouses, our inherited and unconscious gender role. All of those go very deep into our utmost inner selves and soul and subconscious. And to pretend that we're going to be able to access those places and fix them all by ourselves is stubborn, prideful, and ultimately unwise. And right now, I'm not talking about accountability groups or women's groups or men's groups or pastoral meetings, even though all of those have a place and should have a place in your life. I'm talking about professional help with certified counselors and psychologists. I personally have been dealing with that violence in therapy, and it's really hard and really tender, but it has been good. We know that it's mostly our unresolved baggage that comes to sabotage our current relationships. And yet we continuously tend to be hesitant to invest and seek help to fight them properly, especially us men. So if you've never done the therapy thing before, make your aim to go in the next 12 months 10 times to therapy. Go 10 times in 1 year. And please come back and tell me all about it. I would love to hear your stories. We not only carry our own baggage, but we also carry the bad advice that many of us have received all throughout our time in church. And for many of us, very specifically, the premarital training that we received at church. So I asked people, what was the worst premarital advice that you've ever received? And close to 100 people responded. And I made a video about it. So click right over here, and I'll see you there.